I'm Scott Lucas. This is EA Worldview's analysis of Egypt. Was it a coup? Was it not a coup? Was it democracy? Was it not democracy? These are the questions that have been surrounding last Wednesday's takeover of power by the military when they deposed President Morsi. Here's our 4-point guide to understanding what happened and what may happen next. Point 1. It wasn't about democracy. It was about the failure to deliver the basics. In February 2011, when Egyptians rallied in the millions to overthrow the Mubarak regime, the immediate notion was that they had claimed democracy, the right to represent themselves. True, but something else was also being claimed. There was widespread anger, not only at the corruption amongst the Egyptian elites around Mubarak, but about the failure for the 80-90% below the elites to get basic services, guarantees of food, public services, education, sanitation, transport, healthcare. And in July 2013, when President Morsi fell, those issues were still prevalent. Whether or not each of those millions in Tahrir Square, in front of the presidential palace, in other Egyptian cities, had democracy on their lips, it is probable that they were also thinking about other immediate concerns. Interviewed in a survey earlier this year by the Egyptian government and the United Nations, 89% of Egyptians, 89%, said they did not have the money to cover basic needs on a monthly basis. Those Egyptians cited inflation, running at, quote, only 9%, but a prevalent concern in the country. And beyond that inflation, they were facing shortages of fuel, facing shortages of food, and facing the prospect that if the government had to remove subsidies, prices for fuel and food would skyrocket. And indeed, the government was in the position where it might have to remove subsidies. Egypt, which has only enough foreign reserve to cover 3 months of imports. Egypt, which has failed to obtain necessary loans from the International Monetary Fund. Egypt, which is dependent on aid from other Gulf states, handouts, if you will, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait. The Egyptian government could not guarantee people that they would have food, fuel at affordable prices. Those Egyptians also cited problems with sanitation, problems with transportation, problems with the provision of basic security, highlighted, for example, in the attacks on women, which have become more and more prevalent in the last 2 years, despite the promises that the fall of the Mubarak regime would bring a better Egypt for them. So this wasn't democracy. This was the question of day-to-day living, and a government that was being seen as not helping that, but hindering it. Point 2, a politically dysfunctional system. Beyond the economic questions, the basic questions, was a presidency which was unable to get any type of resolution with Parliament, with the judiciary, and with other institutions. In Western shorthand, this is being seen as the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood, the party behind President Morsi, the failure of the so-called First Islamist government. That is a simplification. The basic problem is that Morsi, beyond being an Islamist or part of the Muslim Brotherhood, was unable to control or work with a judiciary which harked back to the Mubarak regime, a judiciary that ruled Parliament to be illegal, a judiciary which ruled Morsi's constitutional process to be illegal, a judiciary which was forcing the government to postpone elections from the spring of 2013 to the autumn, a judiciary which only in the last couple of weeks had challenged Morsi over his powers, specifically over his ability to name even his own prosecutor general. This isn't to say that Morsi was an angel and that he could have saved the system. Indeed, one of his big mistakes last November was in trying to take on this judiciary by grabbing powers, saying he could rule by decree. He couldn't. He couldn't then, he couldn't now. And because he couldn't, he was seen as ineffective. Point 3. So why did the military move now? There have been attempts at mass demonstrations in Cairo, in Tahrir Square, in other cities, early this year, throughout the spring. This time, however, in July 2013, a movement, the rebel movement, was able to mobilize millions of Egyptians. When they mobilized millions of Egyptians, some estimates go as high as 20 million, then Morsi supporters mobilized their hundreds of thousands. They would claim millions. And so the military faced the prospect of mass protest not only occurring within a short distance of each other, but mass protest colliding, leading to violence. And indeed, that violence was taking place throughout June. Dozens killed. The headquarters of Muslim Brotherhood offices torched across the country. Supporters from both sides being beaten up, kidnapped. The military decided that the instability had grown too great, and so on the 23rd of June, they told Morsi he had 1 week to get everything in order. He couldn't. They acted. Not quite as simple as that, but a nice way of connecting what the military did with what millions of Egyptians were doing in complaining about their lives. So point 4, what happens next? Well, the easy answer would be that Morsi's gone. Therefore, someone else will come in charge, an interim president. There will be new elections. A constitution will finally be put through. The military will only be there as a caretaker to help bring this about. That's an easy answer, and it's wrong. The military will be seen of being in charge, not only in charge of a transitional process, but somehow doing something to deal with the immediate economic and political problems. Don't just take my word for it. Go back to 2011, when the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, having watched as Mubarak was overthrown, came into office and said, we will provide within a few months elections, a stable presidency, a stable parliament, a stable legal system, a stable economic system. They did eventually hand over power to a president, to a parliament which was soon ruled illegal, to a constitutional body which was soon ruled illegal. They did that, but they did not do anything to deal with the underlying economic problems that afflicted Egypt. And so it will probably go this time. Egypt, short of funds, unable to reach out to get the necessary investment to keep the country going, will become more and more desperate economically. That 89% who cannot find the money to live on a monthly basis will likely rise to above 90%. And we will be in a Groundhog's Day, where 6 months to a year from now, another elected president, if we have elections, will face the same problems that President Morsi did. I'm Scott Lucas. This has been EA Worldview's Guide to Egypt.